Welcome to part 4. This is when they were releasing the surveillance video, and Dan Bongino was like, "Look, this is a big crisis." And Susie Wiles is kind of like, "I don't think so. He's weathered all this other stuff. I think it's just passing clouds, not a storm." The release of the surveillance video was meant to be a gesture of transparency by Bongino and Patel. It was meant to show that nothing nefarious occurred, but it was all suspect. We all watched. There was a lot of questions that were brought to mind. I know how prisons work, and it raised a lot of questions. None of the three had ever experienced anger at this volume from Trump's conservative base. It was disorienting, especially for Patel and Bongino, whose power and influence had been built online. The movement that had treated them as heroes was suddenly turning on them. The two men were now tightly connected to a memo that stated, in black and white, that while information in the government's possession showed ample evidence of Epstein's own wrongdoing, there was no evidence of a wider conspiracy. The day the memo was released, Bongino showed up to a daily Justice Department meeting with the FBI staff and the Attorney General. He was in a volcanic mood. As soon as he entered the room, he erupted at Bondi, shouting at her. "You fucked this thing up from the start," Bongino yelled. "The way you've been talking about this, that dumb fucking charade with the Epstein files, they're on my desk nonsense, and all the promises to the folks out there." Patel and Bongino both subsequently told a White House official that Bondi needed to resign. 2 days later, on July 9th, the two men were summoned to a meeting with Wiles and Bondi in the Situation Room complex. They were the last to enter the small wood-paneled room. Seated around the table were Bondi, Wiles, Blanche, and Taylor Budowich, one of the Wiles deputies. The moment Bongino sat down, Wiles told him that she'd been informed he leaked a sensitive story about Epstein and Trump to ABC News. "I'll tell you what," Bongino replied. "I'll give you $100,000 cash right now. I'm not kidding. Walk out to the West Exec, put that reporter on speaker, and get him to admit that I leaked it. $100,000. A good reporter would never admit to who the source was. So that's a pretty safe bet, Dan. Wiles snapped back at him. "Well, we all got ourselves into this." Bongino cut her off. No. We didn't get ourselves into anything. I warned you guys about this whole time, and you ignored me. And exactly what I said was going to happen happened. And now you're pretending I was in on this. I was never in on this." Bongino's aggressive response to Wiles startled the others. She was the White House chief of staff, essentially a stand-in for the president. Wiles put Bongino on the spot. "Going forward," she said, "we're all in. We're all going to agree to move forward. Are you in or not?" "No, I'm not," Bongino said. "This is not my plan. I'm not part of this going forward. Forget it. I'm out of here." He stormed out of the Situation Room and onto West Executive Avenue, where he climbed in the back of Patel's armored SUV and directed the driver to take him to FBI headquarters. Some of Bongino's closest friends hoped he would resign right then, an act of protest that would have made him a MAGA martyr and only increased his following. True. But the White House advisors intervened, urging him to stay. If he quit over Epstein and went public, it could severely damage the president. Bongino told associates he would remain for Trump's sake and keep pushing for more Epstein information to be released. Privately, he seethed. In conversations with confidants, he lamented about what the job had cost him. He was on Fox News, being a big crybaby snowflake. The millions of dollars in podcast revenue, family time, his audience. He was getting torn apart over a strategy he had opposed from the start. The relationships at the top of the DOJ were by now beyond dysfunctional. At another July meeting in Wiles' office, Bongino and Patel told Chief of Staff they suspected that Bondi had leaked negative stories about them. "Blondie fucked this whole thing up," Bongino later told a confidant, echoing Loomer's derisive name for the Attorney General. "She was the one on the TV saying over and over again that they had all this stuff. There was never anything. We were always clear about that. But now everyone thinks we did something wrong, and I gave up everything." Bongino complained that he had given up his high-rated show and millions of dollars, and now it's all disappeared because people think we screwed something up with Epstein. Bongino paused. This is going to be President Trump's Iran-Contra. On July 12th, the president took to Truth Social to defend Bondi against criticism and urge his boys and gals to stop time and energy on Jeffrey Epstein, somebody that nobody cares about. Trump told his aides that he was very unhappy with some of his most influential supporters, including Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, all of whom were publicly urging the administration to come clean. Kirk had held a Turning Point USA event the previous day that turned into an Epstein grievance fest, with one speaker after another bashing Bondi over her handling of the situation. Trump had called Kirk and scolded him. Remember? And then Charlie Kirk came out the next day and said, "Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Just have to trust this administration." That was all, y'all. That was all your first mistake, y'all. Nobody in Trump's orbit had a better feel for the younger part of the MAGA base than Kirk, who saw that the Epstein cover-up, as it was now viewed, was capturing attention to an alarming extent. Donald Trump Jr., dumb, and J.D. Vance, failed drag queen, both of whom spent considerable time on X, we know, and were trapped into the same younger and hyper-online portion of the base, were also worried. They urged the White House to change course and force the Justice Department to release more of the files. J.D. Vance is heavily online. He's heavily on X. He's trying to co-opt support from the MAGA base by becoming MAGA, because he's got anti-charisma, as we all know, and everybody hates him. He's not loved by MAGA. Vance made clear to colleagues that he feared losing some of the so-called low-propensity voters, the young men who were not traditional Republicans, but who had voted for the Trump-Vance ticket in 2024. This was an audience tuned into the manosphere podcasters like Joe Rogan, and it was worrisome that the podcast hosts themselves were now rebelling. But there was one major obstacle in the path of a solution. The president himself still had no interest in transparency. He wanted the whole Epstein issue buried, and he was snapping at anyone who mentioned it. His staff largely avoided the subject in their conversations with him, forced to worry among themselves. Finally, on July 16th, in an exasperated Truth Social post, seemingly desperate to make his case in language that might resonate with his base, Trump somewhat nonsensically called the Epstein case a hoax by Democrats, and then proceeded to heap abuse upon members of his own party and base, disavowing their support, calling them past supporters and weaklings who had bought into this bullshit hook, line, and sinker. As the president was trying to redirect everyone away from Epstein on social media, members of both parties began to push the other way. Many Democrats embraced the growing Epstein scandal as a top focus in their messaging and as a weapon against Trump. They were joined by a few renegade Republicans, which added to the political pressure on the president's team. Representatives Thomas Massie, a Republican, and Ro Khanna, a Democrat, filed H.R. 4405, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, in the House, and although they did not yet have the votes for a bill, it would become the next battleground as the president dug in against releasing information. Word reached the White House in late July, meanwhile, that a subpoena would be coming from the House Oversight Committee, led by James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky. It had been pushed by committee Democrats with the help of some Republicans, and it compelled the release of the files that the Justice Department had on Epstein. On the day Trump team learned about the looming subpoena, another Epstein crisis meeting was convened in the Situation Room to discuss the pressure coming from Congress. It included most of the same group: Wiles, Vance, Blanche, Warrington, Patel, Bondi, Blair, Chung, Budowich, and Levitt. Clerk told the group that they would try to make sure that they were cooperating fully with the House subpoena. Priority was to release information that demonstrated Trump was not involved in Epstein's crimes. Blanche gave an assessment of the Epstein material he had personally reviewed and been briefed on, including a volume of child porn. The conversation turned to how these files should be released to the public. The idea was already in the works to put all Epstein material on the website. That way they could overwhelm the magosphere with far greater volumes of real information in the form of a huge database. The website had been easy to build, and they were looking potentially going live within a week. They'd already accumulated a mountain of material that Blanche had been scrolling through, and it includes piles of documents from both civil and criminal cases. They planned to release it all. Blanche could then appear on Rogan's podcast to promote transparency from the White House. God, this is a great fucking article. Can't wait to read this book, Regime Change, by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. I'll be back for the rest of this article.